I sure do love the smell of hot melted brains in the morning, and thanks to the Caribert Archon quest, there are a lot of them to go around right about now. Talk about a mind-blowing quest, am I right? Some great reveals, newfound clarity, and a dozen new questions came out of this baby, so in this video, I want to talk about all of it. And here's how this is going to work. A basic quest recap is going to come first, from which we will pick the most interesting topics to talk about in depth, and then finally we'll end the video with a roundup of all the little tidbits that are worth sharing but not really worth analyzing. And I do have a lot. But please note, I will not be talking about the Chatty Chasm Crystal in this video, mostly because I had so much to say about it that it needed its own video, and it kind of turned into its own complete theory, so consider that a part 2, if you will, coming soon. But with 2 videos to go, there's literally no more time to waste, so let's just get into it. We start the quest by meeting up with Kaeya at a local Sumeru tavern. While chatting with us, Kaeya reveals that he is of Conrian descent, and as far as I know, this is the first time it's actually mentioned in a voiced quest. Now, if you don't read character stories or you miss some of the optional content from Diluc's Hidden Strife event, this should be the first time you learn about this, or at least get confirmation if you are suspicious about it. He also shares his last name, Albric. This reveal prompts Dainsleif to join the conversation. Now, Dain seems to have quite a bit of disdain for Kaeya, which is understandable when he reveals that the founder of the Abyss Order was in fact from the Albric family. And Dain hates the Abyss Order. Now again, if you missed Hidden Strife, what you might not know here is that as well as having the founder of the Abyss Order within their family, the Albrics were a regent family that stepped up to rule Conria when their king, King Ermin, was unable to do so. In other words, this family was important for more reasons than just founding the Abyss Order. One awkward conversation and the offer of a future drink later, Kaeya leaves and the Traveler is left alone with Dain. Dain updates the Traveler on his investigation into the Abyss Order's Loom of Fate operation, and after downing one Death in the Afternoon cocktail, they head off to Avidia Forest to track down the brand new lead. Their survey of the tiny hut and field doesn't turn up much, but nearby monster activity suggests potential leyline shenanigans, so off Dain goes on his own to investigate that. Paimon tells the Traveler to take a nap while they wait, and it's not a bad idea, really. But when the Traveler wakes up, Paimon is gone, but Dain is back. For a minute, anyway. And then he bounces again. And this is the point at which the Traveler starts to unknowingly experience their twins' memories from several hundred years ago. That's why there's no Paimon here, it's just Dain. This is when the, Abyss Twin was traveling with Dainsleif. And that was when the Traveler, posing as the Abyss Twin, met Ida. Ida is emotionally unstable, to say the least, which makes sense. The curse he has, which is the same one as Dain, is supposed to inflict a lot of pain and drive people insane, so that seems to be working. It doesn't help that he spent what seems to be a couple hundred years taking care of his son, Caribert, who was cursed and turned into a Hilichurl. Ida thinks that this Hilichurl curse can be broken and instructs the Traveler on how to make a potential medicine out of 2 plants, 1 weird mushroom, early afternoon water, and a Dendro Archon blessing. The first dose doesn't work at all, so they try again, but before they can give it to Caribert, Ida spots a Hilichurl he mistakes for his son and goes after it. They follow it into some old ruins in the chasm where it meets up with some other Hilichurls. But the Hilichurls are acting very strange, walking towards an unknown destination and periodically bowing down in reverence to some unseen thing. Near their destination, they run into a Cryo-Abyss Herald who spouts some nonsense about fate, challenges the Traveler to a fight, loses, and despite this, Ida is in awe of the Herald, calling it a perfect being. But in the next room, they find a giant, ominous, chained talking crystal hanging from the ceiling, with the same vibes as the defiled statue that was found way back in the We Will Be Reunited questline. The Hilichurls and Ida fall to their knees in prayer, but the Traveler does not, and that's when the floating smoke crystal talks to the Traveler inside of their head. It asks some weird questions, calls itself a sinner and not a god, and that it'll wait for the Traveler at the end of time. I guess it's saying this to the Abyss Twin, but the Abyss Twin also went by the name Traveler, so this is gonna get really confusing. Before they leave, the crystal blesses Ida's anti-Hilichurl medicine, and this blessing is enough to restore Caribert's clarity of mind upon administration. It does not, however, fix his body. Caribert has a meltdown over his appearance, and while Ida does calm him down a little, he also gets some bad ideas. If the crystal can restore Caribert's mind, it can restore his body too, right? It's a real god, a real powerful entity, something he could put his faith into. But we'll never really know if it could do that because on the second trip to the Chasm Ruins, there is no crystal there at all. And when they return back to the hut, Caribert is also gone. They find him at the edge of a cliff in a state of absolute despair after seeing what his face looks like beneath his mask. He loses control, tries to remove his mask, and erupts into an explosion of dark abyssal energy. The force knocks out the traveler, and when they wake up, Ida properly reveals that he's actually Clothar Albrecht and declares that for the fate of his son, he will turn Caribert into the loom of fate, one capable of weaving his own destiny. Clothar proceeds to drop a few more lore bombs, claiming that he knows who the traveler is. He calls them the prince or princess of Conria, as well as their hope, and equates them to the unknowable abyss. He says that whoever can control the abyss can control to that, insinuating that the twins have this capability. And this is when the traveler realizes that they've actually been witnessing their twins' memories, and suddenly, they're back in their own time again, Dane and Paimon standing over them worriedly. Turns out the whole experience was caused by the Abyss Order tampering with the local ley lines. That's business as usual, I guess. Dane then explains that Clothar Albrecht founded the Abyss Order, ran it for about 100 years before he lost his mind entirely, and then promptly disappeared. The traveler suggests at this point that they dig up the field, which reveals two skeletons. One is identified as Clothar Albrecht, and one is identified as his wife. Well, it should be, anyway. With new knowledge in hand, Dane pieces out and the Traveler and Paimon are left on their own once again. Which means that we are now free to dig into the more interesting bits and analyze them. Get the fingers in there and squish them all around. Let's kick off this analysis by starting off with the Abyss twin, whose memories the Traveler was witnessing. The community at large really likes to argue over which twin is canonically the Traveler and which one is canonically the Abyss twin. The answer is both and neither. See, this quest kind of confirmed the idea that the twins think exactly alike. The words the Traveler spoke were the exact same ones that their twins spoke hundreds of years ago. Their thoughts may have differed a little bit, which would make sense, but even then, their actions were identical. This whole thing was kind of already implied during the We Will Be Reunited quest when the Abyss twin confidently claimed the Traveler would reach the same conclusion that they did at the end of their journey, which just means that the twins themselves are interchangeable. It's the journeys that make all the difference. The Traveler met Paimon first, and their entire experience is colored by her, whereas the Abyss twin had Conrian nobility and Dainsleif, I guess. Had the positions been reversed, and they are depending on who's playing, the outcomes would have been the same. Although I suppose you could kind of use this as more evidence that one twin is actually a clone of the other and that they were never actually twins and that their memories are all just falsely implanted, but that's kind of a little too conspiracy even for me, which is saying something. I have no proof or anything to work with to back it up or refute it, so I'm gonna just leave it there. But speaking of journeys, I wanted to take a second look at the Abyss twins' most probable timeline, journey-wise, because we did get some insight here. Judging by the fact that Clothar had been alive for at least a couple of hundred years post-Cataclysm when they met the twin, and Dane was also present, we can now say with certainty that the twins' journey took place after the Cataclysm. That was something that was up in the air before, so this is nice. And that would line up with their appearance in Vanarana as Nara Varuna. Dane may not have been present with the Aranara because he might not have actually been able to see them, or the twin was trying to get a bija for him after he got corrupted or something, because that's what the bija is for, healing. So it's actually like a big crystallized memory fruit kind of thing, which makes sense because like if you're suffering from erosion and your memories go, like a bija would be really useful. But anyway, both of those things are just theories. Don't take them as fact. The idea that Clothar had been alive for a couple hundred years is actually coming more from the idea that, humans live for 100 years anyway, generally, roughly-ish. So living for 150 isn't really a big deal, but 200, 250, 300, that's when I think you'd start to go a little bit mental. So I'm extrapolating based on that. So if we account for all of this new information, the order of events should look something more like this. The twins arrive in Conria from space when the heavens responded to the summoning. One twin woke up and was declared Conrian royalty. Then after a while, the events of the cataclysm would take place, and the twin rushed to wake up their siblings so they could escape Teyvat. And upon escaping Teyvat, or trying to, and reaching the heavens, they were stopped by the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, who either separated the twins by 500 years of time, or just a long distance of space. I'm not sure, it could be both. Either way, the twin would have then visited Sumeru at least 300 years ago to fix the Varuna contraption and meet Clothar. Then the twin would have had a falling out with Dain and joined the Abyss Order. A long time after that, the traveler would have fished up Paimon and set off to find their sibling, and the game begins. I'm still really curious about what caused Dain and the twin to split up when it appears that the two had maintained a good relationship for what seems to be centuries after the cataclysm ended. Dain didn't appear to be angry, so he's either feeling guilty or responsible or something along those lines. So did the twin confront him about the curse on Conria after this event with Clothar and was, given an answer by Dain that he didn't like? Or did Dain disclose something he did or didn't do at a later date voluntarily that changed the twins' opinion of him? I wonder if this was something similar to what happened between Kaeya and Diluc, where Kaeya would be a bit like Dain, feeling guilty over something and coming clean to Diluc about it at the exact wrong time. I'm leaning a bit more towards this answer right now, because now that we can confirm that the Abyss Twin was also a prince or princess of Conria, Dain's title of Royal Guard might imply that it was his job or duty to protect the twins and not King Ermin or the Albricks. I could see a scenario where he might have gotten some priorities mixed up, neglecting to help people in favor of helping the twins. This is also supported by the idea that the Albric, Clothar, didn't seem to recognize the twins' companion in the memory, which should be Dainsleif. If someone from the Regent family doesn't recognize a royal guard, then it's probably likely that they weren't their guard, right? But hey, speaking of the Albricks, what a twist, right? Kaeya being part of the extended family that founded the Abyss Order, I really wasn't expecting that exactly. Now, for those of you who felt Kaeya was tacked onto this quest, he definitely wasn't. And Kaeya's appearance here is definitely foreshadowing. In fact, it's foreshadowing for something that they've been setting up since 1.0. And what is that something, you might be wondering? Well, I suspect it's that Kaeya is, in fact, involved with the Abyss Order. If you think back to the Mondstadt chapter, there were already hints of this. For example, that time Kaeya sent the Traveler away while they were inside one of the temples so that he could be alone with an Abyss Mage. Yes, Diluc showed up and wiped it out before Kaeya could even do anything, but all that does is show that Diluc isn't even willing to listen to a word that the Abyss Order says, and likely doesn't think that Kaeya should either. Then later on, Kaeya opts to not defend the city himself, despite the fact that they already knew exactly when the Abyss Order was planning to attack. Instead, he claims that he was scouting the city, following the trail of some very shadowy, suspicious figures. He even says that he fraternized with the enemy in order to get some intel. And he's also the very first person to tell us about the existence of the Abyss Order's leader, the Abyss Prince or Princess. Now, to be fair, it's equally likely that he captured and tortured an Abyss Mage to get that information, but he could have just as easily bargained for it. The way he says fraternized is kinda vague. Now, I'm not the first person to point out this suspicious behavior of his, though. See, people often cite this one letter that Kaeya wrote for Venti during the first Windbloom event as evidence that he hates the gods. The letter had bits written in Hilichurlian, specifically the phrase "mi muhe ye." A popular fan translation suggested this could be a threatening letter, as the phrase translated into "I triumph over you." However, while this translation was well-intentioned, it's just wrong. Shortly after Windbloom, we got the Mimi Tomo event, where we learned a lot more about Hilichurlian. As it turns out, mi muhe ye means something more along the lines of "I want you." So Venti's translation of "I like you" is probably more accurate, although I do not deny that want can have both positive and negative connotations. But even still, I don't think that this letter was a threat or a warning letter. Mostly because it doesn't actually add up with anything else that Kaeya does. For example, Kaeya hangs out predominantly at Angelshare, and yes, I know he likes alcohol, and this is like the biggest alcohol distributor in the entire city, so that kind of makes sense, but also it's run by Diluc, and Diluc hates the Abyss Order, and I really don't think Diluc would let Kaeya hang around if, he was actively involved in the Abyss Order in a way that would harm Mondstadt. I personally trust Diluc to know what's up. And it's pretty clear that Diluc does trust Kaeya, because they do work together on occasion, and Diluc does trust the information that Kaeya gives him. Yes, they've got a lot of personal grievances to work out, which is probably why they don't work together a lot, but still, if Kaeya was working with the Abyss Order in a way that would harm Mondstadt or anything else around it, Diluc wouldn't do any of those things. It is probably likely that Diluc does not approve of Kaeya mingling with the Abyss Order, because why would you want a knight that's supposed to protect your city mingling with, their sworn enemy? But Kaeya is the type to leverage all available assets to get whatever intel he wants, and if that means infiltrating the Abyss Order, then so be it. Even Jean allows him this courtesy. Now, Dainsleif also questions whether Kaeya can break free of his past, which in this case should be his ties to the Abyss Order through his family bloodline. This is a callback to Mona's horoscope reading of Kaeya, where she says that he thinks he's made a clean break with his past, but that it'll come back to haunt him and bring with it a very difficult choice. Now, given his answers in the latest Archon quest, I am convinced that Kaeya chose Mondstadt over his Conrian roots, but being involved with the Abyss Order has him towing a very dangerous line that would be very easy to cross, hence difficult choice. Now, part of the reason I think this is because Kaeya doesn't seem to have ever been to Conria. At least that's not the impression that I got. However, he was still able to recognize Dainsleif's eyes. So the only other Conrian besides Albedo that we know he has contact with would have been his father, as his mother was never mentioned. Therefore, his father was very likely a full-blooded Conrian, same as Dain. But his mother might not have been. And that would explain why his eyes are different from Dainsleif's. It also means that Kaeya's father may have been from a group of survivors that wandered the wilderness for hundreds of years after the Cataclysm. Since they were all immortal, it's not unreasonable to assume his father witnessed the events firsthand and then later had Kaeya with a non-Conrian woman. However, if this is true, then that makes Kaeya a lot more like Caribert, and by extension, he should be a Hilichurl by now. So why isn't he? If you ask me, it's because Caribert may have been born before the Cataclysm occurred, while Kaeya may have been born after, with the whole probably never been to Conria thing. Now, for the record, I don't believe the theory that Caribert is Kaeya, if only because Clotar's voice is different from the voice of Kaeya's father, which we did hear during the last Weinlesefest. They are obviously related because they're both Albrechts, but it's impossible to point at a specific placement to see their relationship exactly within a family tree. At least for right now, at time of recording. Now keep in mind there appears to be two curses. There's the Hilichurl curse and there's the Immortality curse, also known as the Curse of the Wilderness. Now I am not sure if they're actually two different curses explicitly or if it's one curse affecting two groups of people differently. I'll refer to them separately, even though I'm not entirely convinced that they're two different things. Now, in regards to Kaeya, if he is a half-blooded Conrian, then he should experience the Hilichurl curse effects, whereas if he was a pure-blooded Conrian, he'd be immortal like Dainsleif, right? He appears to be neither because he grew up with Diluc, meaning he was a child at one point and now he is an adult, and we haven't actually seen an instance where a Conrian ages while under the effects of a curse, so we can assume for now that he's completely curse-free. Or that he had a curse and it got broken. Now I know that Dain seems to insist that neither curse can be broken, but there were potentially 3 instances where the curse or curses were broken. Caribert, for example, regained his mind, which is not a complete curse break, but it does suggest it is not impossible for Hilichurls to recover from their condition. Then we have Clotar, who actually died, which is something that's not supposed to happen to an immortal dude. And Clotar's wife had a human skeleton, suggesting that she never changed into a Hilichurl or that she was killed before the transformation took place. I guess the third one doesn't really count too much, but I think it's worth remembering anyway. It kind of helps illustrate that the curses may not have been effective immediately. Like there might be a way to sort of stave them off. There are a few big differences between the Hilichurl curse and the Curse of the Wilderness, however, and I want to take a second to talk about those. Non-pure-blooded Conrians who were cursed were stripped of their minds while their bodies were distorted, turning them into Hilichurls. And unlike those under the Curse of the Wilderness, Hilichurled Conrians are capable of dying, but they probably aren't tortured by it like the immortal Conrians since their minds are already gone. This curse ends up being a bit of a kinder punishment since lacking the awareness of what happened to oneself implies that they will experience less suffering overall. Remember, Caribert did not last long after regaining his mind. Now, like I said, Hilichurls can die, but not necessarily of old age. At least we don't have a case for that yet. It's more like at some point something switches inside of them and they find this calm, dark place like the chasm to just sleep forever and return to goo. We're gonna talk more about this in part 2. It's related to the crystal. But I say that it's unrelated to old age because there are implications that Hilichurls can change form with age and become a Minichurl or a Samichurl or whatever. This suggests that normal Hilichurls should be younger than their other counterparts, yet plenty of normal Hilichurls were found in the chasm returning to goo. And now I'm kind of wondering if Caribert's explosion towards the end was also a very rushed return to goo. Pure-blooded Conrians, on the other hand, were considered the greatest sinners, or the greater sinners, and therefore had the more punishing curse. Now, fun fact, this Curse of the Wilderness is likely referencing a real biblical thing. The Book of Numbers, for example, talks about a group of Israelites who were forced to wander the wilderness for 40 years as punishment for their lack of faith in God, or rather, questioning God's judgment. There are a few other instances, if memory serves, but in this particular case, they were wandering through the harsh landscape of Sinai for these 40 years. There was very little food, water, or comfort, and all but 2 of the cursed people, Joshua and Caleb, would die during those 40 years as they appeared to be the only 2 who truly repented their sin of questioning the divine. Therefore, they deserved to live. So, it's not really a curse of immortality in the Bible, but I still think that this fits the idea of eternal suffering quite well, as a punishment, anyway. Imagine, as the Traveler suggests, having infinite time yet no hope. That could only be something called torture. And that's probably why Clotar loses his mind after a while, right? But what I don't really understand about all of this is why there were 2 punishments for what was essentially an entire race of people. Like, yes, there were some that had this particular bloodline, but Conrians called themselves Conrians if they all shared the same belief. And belief isn't something that you share by blood. So why is one bloodline getting cursed more or less than another? And that actually made me wonder if they're not 2 different curses. If they're actually one curse that manifests differently depending on your bloodline. Think of it as having a natural inbuilt resistance. Now keep in mind, this part is entirely speculative, but I've been wondering if non-pure-blooded Conrians turn into Hilichurls, then is it possible that at some point a pure-blooded Conrian could turn into something else? Like, I don't know, an Abyss Herald? Or Lector? Or Mage? Like, think about it for a second. Hilichurls have a lot in common design-wise with Abyss Mages, and Abyss Mages are related to Heralds and Lectors and the like. We know that the Abysslings are all Conrians, right? But what if they're all pure-blooded Conrians? What if that's why they all have that same black star on their chests? The same as the Black Serpent Knights, the same as Clotar, the same as Halfdan? And what if the Abysslings also have some kind of evolutionary cycle, just like the Hilichurls? Abyss Mages might be the equivalent of a standard Hilichurl and might evolve, so to speak, into a Lector or a Herald or maybe something else that we haven't seen yet over time. And judging by how the Cryo-Abyss Herald spoke, I wonder if this transformation can diverge at some point. Let's say by accepting the call of the Abyss, they would turn into an Abyssling, like a Herald or a Lector. But if they reject it, perhaps they end up hollow, like a Black Serpent Knight. As for Dainsleif, well, remember we talked about the Abyss Twin potentially getting a Bija, and the Bija might have been for him, and the Bija is like this big crystallized memory fruit? that can help someone recover when their brain goes bleh. That might be something that Dane's had. Anyway, I'm just wondering. But I am also wondering about this one really weird thing that Caribert said that really struck me as just odd. When he was talking about how he felt, but just before he regained his senses, he said he felt like he was hiding in a small room and he didn't want to leave. And this is the literal translation from the Chinese text. I did check. Now, out of context, this is pretty insignificant, but coincidentally, I made this theory like a way while back, speculating on what may or may not be inside of the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles cubes. I will leave a link to that video if you're interested, but if not, spoilers! The conclusion I came to was that she had the souls of the people that were turned into Hilichurls locked inside those cubes. So they're minds, right? Minds in a box. Which, you know, that kind of sounds like sleeping in a dark room. A soul trapped inside of a cube. A mind that's trapped somewhere that doesn't want to leave. It's in a little comfy space somewhere in quarantine. Now, I'm not saying that this is confirmation of my theory or anything. I'm definitely not. But I do think the idea is worth revisiting again. Especially since the first question Caribert asks when he wakes up is, am I dead? Okay, I know you guys are all really excited about this crystal that's floating in space, all chained up and weird, and oh my god, they didn't forget the defiled statue, but we're not going to talk about that today. Instead, we're going to wait for part 2, and for now, we're going to proceed to the Rapid-Fire Roundup. All those little tidbits that I want to share that aren't really worth analyzing, but I have things to say. Starting with the Loom of Fate. So it seems that Clothar decided to found the Abyss Order with the express purpose of finding a way to change the fate of his son. It is a little odd that he calls his son the Loom of Fate itself, like his body is gonna become the scaffold of a loom, but I don't think that was quite the intended meaning. It seems more reasonable that this would be like Caribert's legacy or something. In any case, this seems to be a little bit different from the Loom of Fate operation that Dane is investigating, if only because the target seems to be different. Clothar was focused on just changing the fate of his son, but the Abyss Order may have expanded that goal to encompass some bigger ideas, with or without the help of Big Creepy Crystal Man. Either way, the objective appears to be seize the power of destiny itself. It's not really that earth-shattering of a revelation, but it's nice to have confirmation. Moving on, the infamous Death in the Afternoon cocktail. Now, this is a popular cocktail in Mondstadt, and it's a real cocktail too, you know? It's actually one made with absinthe. It's also Kaeya's favorite drink, and it appears to be favored by Dane as well, which makes it all the more funny to me how Kaeya ends their first meeting with an offer to buy him a drink later. I'm just wondering if they're both going to enjoy Deaths in the Afternoon? If that's a Conrian thing, do all Conrians like Death in the Afternoon as a drink? Which actually might be a valid idea, more so than you'd think. Now, you might remember that part of the whole medicine creation process included acquiring water at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's curious that they went out of their way to say 2 o'clock in the afternoon instead of 1400 hours when, you know, the in-game clock uses military time. I think they did this so they could draw attention to the idea that it's early afternoon when you're getting this water. It's in the afternoon, right? But 2 o'clock in the afternoon is 1400 hours in-game time. Now, you know how in some countries, like the US, skyscrapers and hotels will just skip the 13th floor because it's superstitious, like the 13th floor is bad luck? Well, that's called tetraphobia, and in China, it's not the number 13 they do this with, it's the number 14, because the number 14 in Chinese sounds a lot like the words for is dead or will certainly die, depending on the dialect. So 1400 hours is Death in the Afternoon. Now, I'm not saying there is a connection between this will certainly die at 2 o'clock in the afternoon water and the Death in the Afternoon cocktail, but I do find it an odd coincidence considering how the first question Caribert asks after waking up is, am I dead? But speaking of the medicine, there are 4 total ingredients, and the deadly afternoon water is only one of them. The other 3 ingredients are all imposters, weirdly enough. The Kalpalata lotuses are not lotuses, Sumeru roses are not roses, and the red mushroom looks a heck of a lot like a Rukashava mushroom, but definitely is not. Now, the Rukashava mushroom was supposed to be representative of Rukadevada's deceased body, which was weirdly, traditionally, offered to the academia by people and then later eaten by the sages inside of the sanctuary of Surasthana, which is a little uncomfortable to think about because that's also where Nahida was being locked up. So there are just sages going into her prison cell and eating mushrooms that are supposed to represent the body of the former Archon, and it's just, yeah, okay, well, the fact that this lookalike mushroom, this red Rukashava mushroom, was growing in a field where Caribert's mother was buried might imply something similar, that those red mushrooms are related to the deceased body of Caribert's mother that then gets consumed in a medicinal format. Anyway, I think it's a little ironic that it was humans that locked Nahida up and made it impossible for Clothar to actually get a blessing from her via the Statue of Seven, because had she been the one to bless the medicine instead of the creepy crystal man, I wonder how different things would have been. I wonder if there would have been an Abyss Order at all. Now, on a much lighter note, Caribert and Clothar are likely references to real historical figures, but it's kind of debatable which historical figures. There is a man, Clothar II, who had a son, Caribert I. They were kings of the Franks, and the only real connection that I can glean between these two and Genshin is that another one of Clothar II's son had a wife from Toledo in Spain, the same Toledo that was known as Tula, which is a city in Sumeru. However, it's possible that Caribert is referencing the Caribert of Laon, which would make him the maternal grandfather of Charlemagne instead. Now again, we're still looking at kings of the Franks, but roughly 200 years apart. Although Charlemagne was also the king of the Lombards and the emperor of the Romans. Basically, he founded the Carolingian Empire in the early 800s, and if you're curious about this crazy family tree of historical French monarchs, I will leave a link below. But I want to talk about Charlemagne for a second because Charlemagne is actually a pretty interesting connection in Genshin. He has a lot of connections to the Arthurian legends, as they were said to have been written based on him. Although I will point out that the Arthurian legends are debatably older than Charlemagne, but it is historically accurate to say that the two have frequently been equated to each other in some way, shape, or form. Now this matters mostly because Mondstadt draws heavy inspiration from Arthurian legends. There's a sword stuck in the ground with a little kid named Arthur standing next to it, which is obviously supposed to be King Arthur and the Sword in the Stone. And then there's the Knights of Favonius compared to the Knights of the Round Table. And there's also historical figures like Parsifal, which is obviously Percival, right? Knights of the Round Table. And the historical figure of Roland, who should be the Bloodstained Knight, as well as Capitano, if you think the Bloodstained Knight is Capitano. So, fun fact, make him from Mondstadt. Now, Roland is interesting because he references a tale called The Song of Roland, which is set in Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire. Laughing Man has a really interesting video on this, actually, so I'll leave a link to that if you're interested. Now, this time period, this rule of Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire, and the, character of Roland and the Arthurian legends, they're all heavily connected, even anecdotally, to the search for the Holy Grail, which was initially done in the Arthurian legends through the knight Percival, which again is who Parsifal, the Mondstadt historical figure, is based off of. But if you go back to Sumeru, you'll find that there are actually some Holy Grail references, especially in regards to the goddess of flowers and King Deshret. Now, the Holy Grail often makes people think of the Knights Templar, which I know is only connected via some contemporary myths and pseudo-conspiracy theories, but those same myths label them as some of the original Freemasons, and Freemasonry also has connections to Solomon, who has connections to Deshret, and therefore... Sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. But if you are interested in a wacky big brain Genshin conspiracy theory involving Charlemagne and the creepy chasm crystal, then you are gonna love part 2. Because that's what we're gonna talk about. So while the credits roll and I thank all my lovely channel members for all their support that helps to make these videos possible, I will leave you all with this one last little observation. Has anyone noticed how much more insecure Paimon is getting from quest to quest? Like, I really started taking notes of it in the Perilous Trail quest, but it really went up a notch in the 3.0 Archon quest. And in this latest one, I don't know, she feels more insecure than ever. I don't know what it means that Paimon's growing more and more insecure with herself and with her relationship with the Traveler in every Archon quest that passes. Maybe she's becoming more and more aware that the Traveler will have to leave her one day, and when that day comes, she's gonna be all alone. I think when talk of Paimon betraying the Traveler comes up, it's always painted in a Paimon is a spy, or Paimon is an agent of Celestia, or whatever kind of way. But I wonder if she might act for more selfish reasons instead. I wonder if her deep-rooted fear of loneliness would encourage her to sabotage the Traveler's efforts to properly reconnect with her twin, because that would mean they'd leave and she'd be alone. And no one deserves to be alone, and no one wants to be alone. But that also doesn't mean that I'm just gonna stick around, because, you know, dang it, I got a lot of work to do. So you could maybe, like, I don't know, leave me alone, like, just for a bit. I got focus, and focusing is hard. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I know there are probably still a lot of things I didn't cover, like the Conrian's red skies, Paimon screaming at the heavenly principles, and so on, but this will just have to do for now. So take care, guys. I will see you all shortly in part 2, where we will talk about the creepy Chasm Crystal Cinnamon thing, and the twins, and Conria, and Solomon. Bye.